Well, I think that's the time for me to hand over to Don, as he will start now to show you what all this means in reality.
So thank you, Peter. So again, my name is Don Van Syckle, and I've been working with the team since the beginning, as I'm a consultant to the AAO organization. So what we're going to cover now is the kind of main workflow for IHE, and it's called Unified IHE Workflow. So this is the workflow that you'll incorporate when you want to automate the workflow inside of your clinic or practice. And as part of this process, we're always trying to deal with efficiency and patient safety. And so that's always an important piece of any IHE workflow profile. Now, as Peter mentioned before, this is actually called an integration profile. Now, the reality is vendors that want to participate in IHE and in kind of clinic all vendors need to understand and utilize this profile. So whether you're a practice management system, electronic medical record, image management packs, an image display, or IHE devices, you have a part into this workflow, and you all need to take a look at it. We've also, as Peter mentioned, we expanded to include refractive devices, and that's going to be the Joya. We did define workflows earlier as part of the process, and they've all been retired. What we've done is we've basically learned lessons in the past, and we've unified to one workflow. So what happens is we've mirrored this workflow based on 3 models into the real world. And so the first thing that you have to do is you have to determine which model fits your clinic. So if I'm a clinic or a practice, I have to look at the type of devices I want, the type of capabilities they can provide, and I have to determine which model fits me the best. So I'm going to cover those models, and there's 3 of them. As a vendor, you got to do the same thing. You have to look at this and say, which workflows do I want to integrate my products to? And what you'll find out is, sure, you may only interface to one workflow, but in reality, you're most likely going to want to do multiple. So let's take a look. As I mentioned before, we have multiple systems, right? And things typically start, of course, with a practice management system. So what we have here now is we have the ability to manage both patient demographics and updates, and also appointments. And so that information is going to use the HL7 standard, and that's going to interface to an electronic medical record system. And as an option, but a very important option, is the ability to pulse charges so you can deal with billing between those 2 systems. Again, that uses HL7 standards. So this is how the workflow starts. And then the next step, and this is now important for real-world Model 1, is for this model, the electronic health record decides to do the DICOM patient list, and that's called DICOM work list. And so they have that capability. And so what happens now is the electronic medical record takes the information that it received from the practice management system and generates orders for all the IHE devices in the clinic. And then what it will do is it will create a patient list, which is then loaded to the IHE device. So what's happening now, as you can see, is we actually register the patient in the practice management system. We type that information in, and all that data is automatically flows all the way through to the EHR and to the IHE devices. So we only have to input this key information once in the system. So that helps keep patient safety in mind. So what will happen then is on the IHE systems, they'll have a list of all your patients. And then when you want to work on that patient, perform the exam, you basically push some kind of button on the IHE system, and voila, the patient information is actually now incorporated into that IHE device automatically. We don't retype any of that information in. So of course, what do? I do my work, whether it's a fundus photo, whether it's a OCT, visual field, all the different types of devices, and I create my output. So what's next then is I got to now store that output and display it. And so the IHE device then uses DICOM to actually transmit their output data, whatever it happens to be, in different types of images, to an image management or PACS system. And then they take responsibility for storing the data, and they also have the ability to connect to display systems, which can pull that data, query it, display it, and view it for the doctor. So real-world model 1 is very important when the EHR takes the lead of the DICOM modality work list and you choose to have a imaging management PACS system as part of your clinic. Let's take a look at real-world model 2. So real-world model 2, the main difference is that the clinic determines that they do not want to purchase a PACS, so there is no image management system. And so let's take a look at some of the differences in how that workflow works for you. So the beginning starts out the same. There's no difference between how a patient management system, a PMS, connects to an EMR. They do the same HL7 messages to manage the appointments and the patient. And again, they can do billing. Also, the beginning to the IHE device is the same. So what happens now is the EHR does the DICOM work list, the patient list, and it automatically feeds that data to the devices. And again, each device then has to select that patient and do its output. But this is where things differ. At this point, what happens, there is no PACS into the system. And so in this model, what happens is your EHR takes the ownership now of actually storing and displaying the key images and reports generated by all your different devices. So what's happened now is your EHR has raised the bar relative to their DICOM capabilities and now can actually store and display DICOM data. However, there's one key point here. Your EMR is not an archive. If you want an archive and you want to store all the data possible that an IHE device generates, then you need an image management PACS system. The EHRs are not set up to do that. But what happens now is they can store the key images. So a difference that a device system has to be able to manage is the ability to select the key data and send it to the EHR. You don't just blast everything. I just don't give you everything I got. I give you the key images, the images that the doctors wish to display and store, and that gets put into your electronic medical record. And so that's the key difference from a device point of view. And the second point is how do you keep the data? Because without an image management or PACS system, then you don't have a separate device that takes control. So the mechanisms to do that are really based on what the device can do, whether it's create CDs, add memory, however they can secure the data. And it's up to the device manufacturers and the users to work together to make sure they don't lose any of their information. So that's what real world model 2 gives you. And finally, you have real world model 3. Now the key part here is if you take a look at this first, you now have the same type of products that you had in the Model 1. So you do have a PACS system, but the key difference is this. The electronic medical record does not support DICOM. So your EHR doesn't know how to do DICOM. It knows how to do HL7. It manages those demographics and those appointments, and it can create HL7 orders. However, it doesn't understand the DICOM specification. So what happens is the image management system takes that role for the EHR. It says, I'll do it for you. And so what happens is the EHR has to send the HL7 order information so it knows the patient demographics and what type of procedure I want to perform and send that to the PACS. And then the PACS will actually then generate the DICOM modality work list, which will automate that workflow for your IHE devices. So from the IHE device point of view, it looks the same. I'm just pointing to a different device to get that work list. So I'm able to still get my work list. I'm able to automate the inclusion of the patient and procedure data into my device. And then, of course, I create my output. Now, the output is the same as Real World Model 1, right? I do my DICOM store. The PACS takes responsibility. And, of course, we have the ability to display the data. So what's important for you now is as a clinic or as a vendor, you have to look at these models and find out which model fits you the best, and then you purchase your products based on those models. Now, as we talked about before, when you look into the details of IHE, what happens is IHE defines integration profiles, okay, that's unified eye care. It defines actors, Okay, a practice management system is not an actor. An actor is a patient registration source, an appointment scheduler, for example. And then it finds transactions. So this slide here shows you how we put this together as part of the workflow in Unified IHE. So what we're showing you here is, for example, let's say I am a practice management system. And so when you look at that, what you have to do as a product is you have to say, what actors fit me? What works for me in my system? And so as an example here, a practice management system would say, hey, I got to register the patient, so therefore I must be a patient registration source. Boom. Then second, it says, you know what though, I'm also got to manage the appointments. I got to schedule the appointments for each patient. So then they also take on that actor. So those two actors, for example, would be required for any practice management system. You got to do those two features. Then, of course, on the reverse side is the EHR. They receive that data, right? So they're going to be a patient registration consumer, and they're also going to be an appointment consumer. So they're going to take that information from your practice management system, which has to be HL7 messages, and process that data. And so what happens is IHE gives you this information so you know exactly what you need to implement as part of a vendor. And what happens is you have the actors, and then on the left side, for example, the top is you have the transactions. So it says, hey, the patient registration source works with the patient registration consumer to do a patient registration transaction called IHE 15. And this is how you have to learn and read these specifications. Now, if you look at this, you also have some optional capabilities. Some things are mandatory, some things are optional. And so one of the optional capabilities is the ability to process charges. Okay, and so that right there is one extra actor and transaction. And then, of course, merging IDs. If you need to merge a patient ID because you made a mistake there, that is also an optional feature. So these type of figures are important for you when you actually want to implement the IHE Unified IHE. And so here's now the picture for the real world model 1. Now we've already talked about how a practice management system can connect to an EHR and how that is accomplished. But then remember the next flow. The next flow now is an EHR needs to connect to a device to be able to send that modality work list, that patient list, to each device. And so you have an actor called the order filler, and then you have the actor down below. Now the actor down below is called an acquisition modality. Now that's kind of a funny name. That name kind of came from other specialties. It came from radiology. But what that really means to you is that's your acquisition device. So that's your IHE instrument. So it's an OCT, it's your slit lamp, it's your fundus photo, it's whatever you happen to be. And so if you're an acquisition, okay, if you're an IHE device, then you're going to be an acquisition modality actor. So of course you receive the DICOM modality work list, then you create the DICOM images to be stored to an image manager, and then you have display systems. So it's important for you to follow this workflow and find out what actor or actors you're going to implement. Real world model 2, again, the same thing. I'm not going to repeat it all, but you have the various actors, but now there's no packs. So you see the workflow. And so a key addition to this is an actor on the electronic medical record. So of course it still has to be a patient registration consumer. It has to be the order filler to provide that work list, and optionally it might be an appointment consumer, or excuse me, it might also deal with the posting of charges. But the key addition is if I'm doing real world model 2, I now can do DICOM image storage and display. So that's a new actor that your EHR would incorporate into their product. And I can tell you now there's many of our products that have worked and are doing that actor today. And then again, real world model 3, the main difference here, of course, was that your EHR does not do DICOM, therefore it uses HL7 only, and your image manager provides your work list. This next table is a very important table. Now, of course, it's very detailed, and I'm not going to go through that table. But you as a vendor, this is the payload. So what happens now is let's do a brief explanation of how to read this table. So the far left side is your actor. We've already talked about actors, and you know you're going to pick one or more actors for your products. And so once you do that, that's the first step. The next step then is it will tell you exactly what your transaction or transactions are that you must support. So what happens now is those transactions, those are your standards, right? That's going to be your HL7, going to be your DICOM, whatever it happens to be. And this is what you're going to implement. And so you look at that transaction, which gets you detailed specification on how to do this, okay, based on the standards. And you look at which model then you're going to support. If I'm supporting all 3 models, okay, then I need to look at the transactions for all 3 models and support them properly. If I choose to support 1, 2, or whatever the combination is, I look at this table. So this table is key for you. And I'm showing you another part. This is a continuing part of that table, but again, you have to look at your actor, and that gives you the start for you. As part of Unified IHE workflow, we've also added the capability for refractive measurements. So what we've done is we extended the U-Eyecare for this capability. And as we mentioned before, it's going to cover refractive devices such as autokeratometers, lensometers, autorefractors, and these type of systems. It's based on a specification called JOIA, Japan Ophthalmic Instruments Association. And what happens is an XML-based data stream. In order to accomplish this, we really have 2 workflow models that are defined. One is where you incorporate the refractive measurements without the patient ID, and the other one with a valid patient ID. Now the reality is this is a connection between your EHR and your refractive devices. So let's take a look at the workflow here. So if I'm incorporating refractive devices in my system, of course, I still have a practice management system and an EHR that needs to coordinate the patient and appointment data. None of that changes. So that's exactly the same thing as you saw in Real World Model 1, 2, and 3, and also here for refractive measurements. But of course, the difference now is I'm connecting to a device that is not necessarily has as much computer power as you do when it's a OCT or when it's a fundus photo. And so that's where this is a different workflow, and it changes. So the first workflow is basically with no patient ID. So what happens is right now is quite often when I connect to these devices, we typically do it in proprietary mechanisms. And often those devices do not have any capability to capture or know a valid patient ID. And so what happens is you have to actually establish a patient context between your EHR and the refractive device where I know I'm opening up patient Jane Smith, and then I'm starting to receive the refractive measurements based on that patient. And so that capability, which is something we do today in a proprietary fashion, really doesn't change here. But the main difference now is we standardize the XML data stream, so we're able to accomplish this the same way with all the different refractive devices. So if I have 2 lensometers, it's the same data stream. It's not data stream from vendor 1, vendor 2, that's completely proprietary. It would be the same. And so we basically standardize that data stream that is connected to the EHR. However, there are some refractive devices that have some capabilities to actually generate or create a valid patient ID. I guess they're not really creating it, of course. That comes from the practice management system. But they might have like barcode capability or something that they can input it into their system. So in this case now, what happens is we don't have to establish the patient context, and we're able to establish a workflow that we trust that patient ID that was generated on the refractive device, and that information is part of the data stream that's sent to the EHR. And so both of these workflows are legit, and both of these workflows will happen within the same clinic, where you have some devices that are not able to do a valid patient ID and others that may. And so the reality is, if I'm an EHR, I need to support both of these capabilities because that's what happens in the real world in order to solve this for our clinics. Just a brief slide here is a lot of the refractive devices, again, are not devices with a lot of computer power behind them. And so it's not uncommon for vendors to actually have the ability to use a computer to connect to multiple of these devices, and what they'll do is they'll actually input the proprietary vendor-specific data into the computer, but then now they can convert that and output that into the valid Joya data streams in the transactions we define in IHE. And that computer that would do that is actually called a refractive measurement source importer. So I import data from the proprietary systems, from the instruments, and I'm able to convert it over to a standardized transaction. So to sum up on the Joya, so basically the Joya is an XML-based specification. It uses version 1.5. Again, it has data classifications. Those are for the keratometer, again, the refractometer, lensometer, and so on. If you have a system that can do multiple, refractive system that can do multiple of these classifications, you can actually have more than one data classification in one file. So you have to be able to process that from an EHR. We don't define the transport. Okay, it's not defined in Joya, not defined in IHE. And also we are working to update Joya. So one of the classifications that were not covered is a output, a data stream from an autophoropter. And so we've been working together with Joya to update their standard to incorporate that type of device. And so the good news is we've already started that process. We've worked together, we've worked hard with them, and we expect this year that to be incorporated in the Joya standard. Also, one side note, important side note, is Joya is actually working with ISO to make this specification an ISO standard. So we should be expecting that soon. And so one of the things that you might notice now is we may actually talk about an ISO standard instead of the Joya standard, okay? But in reality, it's the same thing that's going to be accepted into the ISO. So, as a summary for unified eye care workflow, the first thing we're doing is we're really trying to automate the workflow in the practice, and we always have efficiency and patient safety in mind when we do this. It fits every eye care product. I don't care which product you are. If you're in eye care, unified eye care workflow fits your product. Yes, it deals with patient demographics, it deals with appointments, billings, we deal with images, refraction measurements, reports, and more. We input the data only once, okay, so we have the safety of that information going through. So when I get that patient, I register in the practice management system, and it flows seamlessly to every other system. But you also need to pick the workflow that fits your practice. Am I Model 1, Model 2, Model 3? And lastly, the AAO recommends clinicians purchase systems that implement unified eye care. So the AAO is really pushing very hard that we think our users need to purchase these systems because it's proven to work well. And don't forget, okay, we have a process called a Connectathon, as we talked about before, that enables the vendors to come together and test. So have you tested your system in the Connectathon is very important. And then, of course, showing it at an AAO demonstration helps see that to the clinicians. So, Peter, thank you very much, and I'm going to hand it back over to you to talk about the last two topics.